What's something people don't know about the 1980s drug smuggling era? Our story took place in 1983. At that time, at the beginning of the 80s, drug smuggling to America was flourishing. The Colombian drug gangs, led by the Medellín Cartel, which is a gang Escobar was recruiting many American citizens to work with them as smugglers. The American authorities at the time intensified the confrontation and declared war on these smugglers. Of course, all these efforts were led by the Drug Enforcement Administration, which they called American smugglers. They would fly in their small private planes to Colombia, and from there they would take the drug load from the gang they were dealing with. Then they would fly back to America again and smuggle this load into the country. The drug trafficking networks inside would begin distributing it and selling it to addicts. The Drug Enforcement Administration identified the state of Florida as the main port through which most of the drugs enter the country because it is the closest state to Colombia. These small planes that the smugglers use could not fly long distances. The oil tanks there are small, so they had to take the shortest possible route, which is the route between Florida and Colombia. The Drug Enforcement Administration had their eyes on Florida in particular, and through their surveillance they set a certain pattern for the shapes of these smugglers. You find them wearing gold chains, expensive watches, and their clothes and glasses are all the same. You feel that they have won in the Drug Enforcement Administration. They were always targeting smugglers and arresting them. The number of agents they had in Florida was greater than any other place. Imagine that they created a huge surveillance network with radars. They distributed radars around all of Florida, focusing on the coastal areas because these are the areas from which the smugglers fly. They were not satisfied with just ground radars. They also had a network of air radars carried on planes. These planes were flying air patrols constantly around the clock. Even the American naval forces helped in the mission. They were monitoring the surrounding areas, these border areas, with the radars of their huge warships. This means that the group was covered by land, air, and sea with constant surveillance with radars. The smugglers' job was very difficult, and even the Drug Enforcement Administration started playing it smart. Instead of arresting the smuggler as soon as they discover him, they let us continue. The thing, and they make me sit and watch him. So this thing leads them to the drug dealers who distribute inside the country. So with one blow they arrest the smuggler and the dealer and confiscate the drugs, and with them the money that they might have earned. I mean, the smuggling business at that time was a very difficult thing, and many smugglers were arrested, and some of them even gave up the business completely. But one man was going to challenge this entire system, and he was going to smuggle a quantity of drugs greater than any other smuggler, a quantity worth billions. This man was using very smart methods because of this huge security radar network in the anti-narcotics department. They knew about you, they knew that he was there, but they were unable to reach him even though they allocated a special pursuit force for him alone, and his case was the highest priority case for them because he was doing what dozens of smugglers did on his own. So who is this man, and how did he do it, and how did he remain hidden from them for such a long time? The reason that made the task difficult for them is because they were searching in the wrong place. This smuggler was not operating in Florida and did not even fit the usual pattern of the usual smugglers. This man, his name was, and he was in fact a businessman and an upstanding citizen, at least apparently living in this city. He used to befriend politicians and important people. This is even a picture of him with the former U.S. President, Grand Four. I mean, he was a well-connected person. Anyone who saw him would never imagine that he was a drug smuggler. What helped him after that was that he was an expert and a top-level aviation engineer. Rick was obsessed with flying when he was young. You know the kid who, when you ask her what her dream is when she grows up, and she says to you, a pilot? This was Rick since he was 6 years old. Imagine that he got his pilot's license when he was in high school. At that time, we hardly got a driver's license. The boyfriend got pilot's licenses. Of course, after he finished school, he went to the aviation college. There he studied everything about aviation, from piloting to engineering. He graduated from the college as a professor, and completed his aviation studies. A short time later, he started his own business and opened a company. He called it Air America. This company specialized in modifying small private planes, like the planes you see in front of you. What were the modifications they did? For example, they could expand the fuel tanks in it. Instead of the plane, for example, flying 1,000 kilometers, they could make it fly many times the distance without needing to be refueled. Of course, if you expand the fuel tanks, the weight of the plane will increase, so the wings would have to be modified and made stronger. The wheels might also need to be replaced. These were the modifications that Rico and his company made to the planes. His work was professional and clean, so the company's name became popular and it gained a great reputation and fame. Business flourished, and it began to bring in a good income. This gave him a high social status and gave him the opportunity to befriend important people in society. He befriended the police chiefs and the governor of the state. He even flew with him a few times and followed him in business matters and things that could be developed in the city. He became a leader who attended events and parties. The mission, and even as we said, I got to know the American president at that time on one of these occasions. I mean, the man became an important figure in society, and things were going as well as possible in all aspects until the year 1980 came. That year, an economic crisis occurred that greatly affected the entire world, and America in particular. At that time, Rick's company was greatly affected, and the usual customers who were company owners and businessmen suddenly disappeared, and no one started coming. Little by little, they were replaced by another type of customers, suspicious customers who you feel are closer to gangsters. Their requests were always that they wanted to modify their planes and leave hidden storage spaces in them, places where they could put items or merchandise that would not be easy to detect even if the plane was searched. I mean, suspicious requests like this, when someone requests them on his plane, what do you expect from him? He is certainly smuggling forbidden things, but he knew that this is most likely what they wanted. But the bad economic and financial situation that his company was going through made him accept with these customers, and he makes the suspicious modifications they request, and he continued to work with these types of customers for a while. Imagine that one time, one of these suspicious customers, after he left and the workers were making the modifications he requested on his plane, insisted on paying his bill with narcotic pills. So he gave him a bag full of these pills and told him that their value was greater than the bill he owed, and he refused to pay him his money. Because he needed the money to pay his workers, he had no choice but to take this bag and try to sell the pills in it. What is funny is that the first time he tried to sell it, it was to an undercover policeman, meaning he was caught the first time. They immediately confiscated these pills from him and took me into custody with them so that they would respond to him. Through the interrogation and investigation with him, they learned that he was not a real drug dealer, but rather just a businessman from a financially troubled company trying to save himself in any way. They did not feel that he was a dangerous person, but later the anti-narcotics department offered him a deal. They told him that they would divorce him. Your way, and we will let you go without prison and without punishment in exchange for you informing us about your suspicious clients, because they knew that many of his clients were drug smugglers and that they were modifying their planes to use them for smuggling. And indeed, Rick agreed to the deal with them and would inform them about any suspicious people or activities that occurred in his company. But even though he knew that most of our clients were smugglers or had a relationship with smuggling, he did not understand the extent of their work. He did not start to focus and monitor them. He knew that these clients were getting millions for their work, unlike him who was barely managing his affairs. From then on, thoughts started playing in his head. He started thinking, why don't I get these millions? I am more deserving than this scum. In 1981, through one of our clients, Rick managed to reach a gang of smugglers. Their headquarters and main location was in the city of Tampa in Florida. Of course, as we said, the state of Florida is the center for most of these smugglers because it is the closest state to Colombia. This gang of smugglers, whoever gets to know them, will receive a respectable sum in exchange for carrying out a few smuggling operations for them. That means Rick would be the smuggler and he would be the pilot. At that time, his company was on the verge of bankruptcy, so this made him accept the offer immediately. His thinking at that time was that the job would be a temporary job from which he would earn some money and invest this money in his business and his company and let it get its life back on track. Then he would leave this smuggling business and go back to focusing on it. But when he started working with this gang of smugglers, he discovered that their work was a hobby, and even most of them were addicts, meaning smugglers and users of drugs. This greatly affected the work because they were not people one could depend on, and all of their work was tiring and delicate. Even when you enter their planes, you find the extra fuel tanks placed inside the cabin, exposed, and the goods and drugs thrown around them randomly. The worst of all of this is that the center of the gang is in Florida, which is full of agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration and their radars. But Rick, from his first trip, was able to avoid these radars and get out and return to Florida without being caught. He really deserved the amount they gave him, and it was a respectable amount, meaning it would greatly help his company. The team in total carried out 3 smuggling operations with this gang, and after that, he decided to leave them, because each time he felt that the operation was becoming more and more dangerous due to their work and equipment. At that time, he felt that this was the end of his career in the field, but his professionalism in work and precise performance compared to other smugglers attracted the attention of the big leaders who are the drug producers in Colombia, the real drug dealers, not these small smugglers. So, people from the Medellín Cartel, which is a gang, contacted him. Who is Escobar's gang? The leader he was communicating with was his name, and he was Escobar's friend and the founding partner of the Medellín Cartel, who were, of course, responsible for the largest percentage of the cocaine entering America. So this is someone who came from the top, and he himself had a desire to meet Rick and talk to him because he felt and saw that Rick had great potential and could be useful to them. So they sat together, and he was convinced to return to the field of smuggling again, because when you have direct contact with a leader like him, then you have reached the top here. There is no chance like this. Don't be short of someone who rode millions and a life of wealth and told him they would change his life completely. Rick was still in a bad financial situation and needed every cent he could get to save himself and his company. He agreed to the work, but at the end of their agreement, she gave him a warning. She told him, if you cheat on us one day, we will kill you wherever you are, we will reach you and kill you. He knew and understood the world he had entered, but he was prepared for the first challenge he would face and how he would get from Falls, Pennsylvania to Colombia directly without having to get off and cross oil, because this trip is about 5,000 kilometers long. And the range of regular small planes barely reaches 1,500 kilometers. He needed double this distance. So most of the smugglers were flying from Florida because it was closer, and yet they still needed extra oil. They tried to modify their planes or carry extra oil containers with them, like we saw in the plane of the smuggling gang that he worked with before. But flying from Pennsylvania to Colombia would be much more difficult, and would require him to make modifications to his plane stronger than any modifications he had made before. He brought a plane of a type they call the Cessna 310, one of the models he had worked on the most before, and he knew all its details and parts. The normal range of this plane was about 1,500 kilometers. So the first step was to modify the capacity of the plane's oil tanks. Sometimes its tank is about 2,000 gallons, so imagine if he modified it and made it reach 6,000 gallons, he tripled the oil it can carry. Usually, other smugglers, as we saw, put oil barrels inside the plane's cabin, and this attracts the attention of the authorities because they search for the planes. The suspicious ones that have modifications like these that look like they have extensions are strange or unusual. Rick didn't make any exposed extensions, but he brought strong rubber bags that he could fill with petrol in different places in the plane's fuselage. Believe me, you'd be surprised by the amount of empty spaces in the fuselage of these planes. Rick hid the bags in the nose of the plane, under the floor, in the luggage compartments, and on the sides of the wings. He didn't leave a single empty spot in the plane that he didn't take advantage of. Of course, based on his experience, he made connections that would bring the petrol from these bags to the engine evenly. That means all the bags would decrease together, because if the weight of a specific bag decreases without the rest of the bags, the plane's balance would be upset. But of course, adding all this petrol would add extra weight and load to the plane. The team needed to modify and strengthen the wings, and they also needed to strengthen the wheel supports. They also needed a stronger engine to carry all this weight, so they changed the entire engine. He made all these modifications and made sure that everything was in perfect condition. And the work is clean. Anyone who saw this plane from the outside would say it is impossible that the plane could fly from Pennsylvania to Colombia and travel 5,000 kilometers without refueling, but Rick was like a magician in his field. In addition to all these external modifications, he also modified the inside of the plane, installing a radar device that could detect other radars and air patrols carried out by the Drug Enforcement Administration. The team was not only modifying the plane, but was trying to think intelligently and find ways to ensure that he would not get caught. In addition to all this, he was able to find a corrupt customs agent and bribe him to give him the locations of the radars and patrol schedules so that he could avoid them easily. Are we done here? We only have a radio communications network along this line from Venezuela to Colombia, a network that he uses with a secret code through which he can communicate directly with the cartel. That means he does not go and call them on the phone because these communications could be monitored. The team was smart and cautious and liked to calculate everything before making a mistake. Even one step, and you will know something. During this period, he maintained his relationship with the Drug Enforcement Administration, the agents who recruited him to meet with the clients of the suspects when he was caught before trying to sell narcotic pills. He became close to these agents and spoke to them daily and played the role of a cooperative person. He actually sometimes gave them useful information and helped them catch some smugglers. The agents trusted him and did not know that behind them he was preparing the smuggling operation, bigger than any operation they had seen before. Finally, after 3 months of research and planning, he completed his first trip and took a direct route from the state of Pennsylvania to Colombia. The trip took 13 full hours, 5,000 kilometers, which he covered without needing to fill up the gas tank again. When he arrived in Colombia, specifically at the area they had agreed upon, he landed at the airstrip, which was not a real airstrip, and it was not a piece of flat land like a large field. The gang members were waiting for us there, and as soon as he landed, they wanted to load the drugs onto his plane and return. The oil was running low, and they were about to finish their work. He sat down to rest a little from this long journey, and at the same time began to calculate the weight of the new plane with the extra load. He also began to calculate the length of the runway or the path from which he would fly, because the more weight there was, the further the plane needed to take off. Therefore, these calculations had to be accurate. The problem was that this path or field was not paved, and the worst thing was that during some of the ascents and descents, at the end of it, there were a group of trees, according to Rick's calculations. So the takeoff would be on the edge at the end of the path if everything went well. Indeed, the plane suffered during takeoff at the beginning, but at the end of the path, as Rick expected, the plane was able to take off without crashing, unlike many other smugglers whose planes crashed due to the weight of the extra load. However, the new powerful engine that he installed on the plane proved its effectiveness and its ability to bear this extra load. On the way back, he took a second, longer route, but it was supposed to be safe, and he was far from the equipment of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Border Security Forces and their radars. He could have taken this route because he had supplied the plane with more oil than he needed, so he said, "Why not take the farther and safer route?" But while he was flying in the middle of the air, the radar he had inside the plane alerted him that there was another plane following him. This plane was a surveillance plane belonging to the Navy. These planes patrol the entire border, so he could have encountered one of them anywhere. Now this plane was following him, and if it got close to him, his journey would have ended, and they would arrest him. If he tried to resist or try to escape from them, they would have opened fire on him and destroyed his plane. Now he had to get rid of them as quickly as possible before they got close to him. The problem was that they had him on their radar, and his speed wouldn't allow him to escape from them. Imagine that the only solution he had in front of him was to enter a storm. There was a thunderstorm in an area close to them. Rick entered it, and the radar signal would be disrupted, and he was able to escape. Of course, this is very risky, but if the choice in front of you is either to spend the rest of your life in prison or to enter a dangerous thunderstorm, then there is a high probability that you will choose the storm. And this is what Rick did. And he immediately entered the storm without hesitation, even hoping that the naval pilot behind him would not be ready to catch him inside it. And indeed, the naval plane did not catch up with him, and its signals were lost from their radars. Fortunately, he was a professional pilot, and most likely he was the best pilot among all the smugglers. After 2 hours, he was able to get out of the storm without anything hitting him, and he turned the plane immediately towards his city, towards the mainland. He was, of course, flying at a low altitude so that the radars would not detect him, and he landed on a deserted landing strip, but he did not land completely. He just touched the strip and flew again immediately. You ask why he did this move, the reason being so that he could fly upwards and be picked up by the authorities' radars on the basis that he was leaving this place, as if he had taken off from this place, not as if he had come from a long flight from Colombia. So he would appear on the authorities' radars as if he had a regular plane that was flying inside the country. Then he went to the airport in Scranton, which is his hometown, and contacted the control tower and officially registered his arrival on the basis that he was on a short trip inside the state, not that he was coming from another country. In the official records, it would be registered that he was coming from a short trip, and suspicion would be further removed from him. In the first place, there was no suspicion on pilots in this area because the authorities were aware that all the smugglers were in Florida and did not imagine that there was a smuggler who could modify a small plane so that it could fly the entire distance. When Rick arrived safely in the city, people came to receive the goods from him. These were the drug dealers and distributors who work inside the country. They took this shipment from him, which was approximately a full ton of cocaine, and in exchange, Rick took $1 million for a single trip. But the cartel leaders were impressed by his performance and innovative methods, so they let him make smuggling equipment throughout that year, and he would escape on every trip. Quantities reached hundreds of kilograms of cocaine, and each time he would take $1 million or more per flight. He began to collect this money and became a truly wealthy man, more than anything he had ever dreamed of. Imagine that later he began to expand his operations and formed his own gang and employed other pilots with him, and the number of flights increased significantly. Of course, everything was under his supervision, especially the modifications of the planes. He would not use a plane unless it was modified professionally and cleanly, orderly work. And he finally became comfortable in this new world of ours, and even a large part of his caution. Always caution decreases when a person is experienced in his work. The first time he might be more cautious and afraid. The next time, the fear decreases, and the times after that, he begins to get used to it, and the fear goes away, and thus he loses caution. Imagine that because of the large number of smuggling operations that the cartel was carrying out, they began to tell it to calm down because it was transporting faster than their production capacity. Their production could no longer keep up with its speed in smuggling to this degree. A team that was proud of its work and the level it had reached, and sometimes it would joke with its friends, the pilot's friends, and say, "For them, we have become the express mail for drugs." Imagine that his gang never lost a flight or a plane, even though it was expected in the field of smuggling. It is expected that sometimes problems, accidents, or arrests would occur, but Rico and his gang never lost a plane or a shipment of goods. The cartel leaders were impressed by him and would always reward him with sums higher than the amounts they had agreed upon because he was actually saving them a lot and transporting their goods in a better way than they had even dreamed of. Imagine that throughout this period, he focused on maintaining his relationship with the agents of the Drug Enforcement Administration, the agents who had no idea that he was a smuggler and thought that he was cooperating with them. In fact, he was giving them useful information, but he chose this information in a way that was useful to them, but it could not harm him directly, so that it would appear that he was still cooperating with them. And they were happy to hold him accountable because he was their man, and that he was leaking them inside information, and that he was delving into the gangs. This was between the smugglers to leak them information, and in reality, he was behind them, the biggest smuggler in the whole country. But in 1984, the disaster happened. Do you remember the smuggling gang that he worked for in his first operations? The gang in Florida. This gang was arrested, and Rico was arrested with them as well, on the basis that he had worked for them before. So he was not arrested because of their current operations. He was not arrested because of the first operations. In total, 15 people were arrested, including him, and they were all sent to the state of Florida to be tried there on the basis that their crimes, which were smuggling, happened in Florida. During the trial, he admitted that he had actually carried out these smuggling operations with the gang, but he said that he did them in order to cooperate with the Drug Enforcement Administration in order to provide them with more useful and in-depth information about the drug smuggling movement into the country. Imagine that he even convinced the drug enforcement agents he dealt with to come and testify against us in court. They seriously thought that we were their friend and their man on the inside, and that he was doing all of this in order to cooperate with them. So they testified that he was an excellent informant who was giving them useful information. At the same time, he was afraid of the Colombians and the cartel leaders. He was afraid that news of the trial and its cooperation with the Drug Enforcement Administration would reach them, and they would think he was a traitor because he was trying to play both sides. In order for Ricky to convince them that he wasn't betraying them, he would go on smuggling trips between the court sessions. He was on trial for smuggling charges, and at the end of the week between his trial sessions, he would go on smuggling trips. It's not normal, man. Or maybe he was afraid of the cartel that you call it. Anyway, he was insane. This trial lasted for 11 weeks. Every weekend he would go on a smuggling trip. He made 11 smuggling trips and earned $13 million from these trips while he was on trial. In the end, out of the 15 defendants, he was the only defendant who was acquitted because of the testimony of the Drug Enforcement Administration agents. By God, it's a plot that you don't find in movies. Of course, its success in the field of smuggling made. He had tens of millions in his hands, but these millions needed to be laundered. He couldn't use them freely, so he sought help from a man named Michael Coffey, who worked in a bank and specialized in money. With his help, he was able to launder most of his money. Michael would send his money to foreign accounts outside America and then return it to America in a way that made it appear as clean money. Of course, he would take a percentage, but then they faced a new problem. One of our pilots who worked for his gang was a man named Jim Cooper. This pilot was returning from Colombia carrying merchandise with him, so there was another person, a local drug distributor or dealer, waiting for him downstairs to unload the merchandise and take it. But by mistake, Jim happened to be driving his car and wanted to land at the airport. The drug dealer was driving his car and stopped in his path, so he ran into him and killed him. The incident was reported, and the police arrived and discovered the type of cargo Jim was carrying. They knew he was a smuggler and arrested him immediately. Now, they didn't just say it was smuggling, but they also accused him of involuntary manslaughter. After the investigation was over, and they gave him a call so he could call anyone he wanted. The first person that came to Jim's mind was his gang leader when he made the news terrifying. He could have tried to reach a solution with him and told him, for example, take this million and be quiet, or use it to escape, but he chose to abandon Yanba completely and leave him alone. Now Jim, after he felt that he was the gang leader, abandoned him and saw that he was facing a dangerous situation that could throw him in the record for 30 or 40 years. He decided to make a deal with the authorities and take his horse and drop all the charges against him in exchange for him providing them with information about Rick and the smuggling operations. He gathered and gave them everything he had, and through his confessions their moves against Rick and his company, Air America. Of course, they couldn't just go and believe Rick based on his friend Jim's confession. They needed to get more evidence from him. So they started to review everything he lost. They reviewed his company, their bills, their calls, their movements, and even their bank accounts. Of course, a huge investigation like this, no matter how many clients are working on it, will take some time for the team. Notice that they are investigating him, and he knew that sooner or later they would arrest us. So what did he do? He went and transferred $30 million to an external account outside America, specifically to the Cayman Islands, and then he boarded his plane and fled to the same place, to the islands. His choice of these islands was because they did not have an extradition treaty with America. But unfortunately, his calculations were wrong. The authorities were able to trace his money to this island, and they knew that he was there, so they sent a report about him to the local authorities on the island. The local authorities responded to them. It is true that there was no extradition treaty between them, but in the end, the authorities there considered Rick a troublemaker and an unwanted person. In 1986, the local island police arrested him and took him to the airport, and from there they handed him over to the American authorities. After they brought him back with them, they began to investigate him. Of course, the charges against him were crazy. There is no need to list them. He was threatened with a sentence that could reach 35 years in prison. So in order to avoid this crazy sentence, he decided that he cooperated with the investigators and told them where he hid his money, and they confiscated more than $21 million in cash. It was like mountains, man. Of course, in addition to the money, he disclosed his entire operation and explained to them all its details and the details of its operation. After that, he handed over all of his pilots and gang members, and they all went to prison with varying sentences. Because he was cooperative, he was given a reduced sentence of 8.5 years. But frankly, it is a short period for the biggest smuggler who has passed through America. You can imagine that this man brought dozens of tons of cocaine into the country. God knows how many people, how many children, and how many families had their lives destroyed because of drugs. But the Drug Enforcement Administration saw that obtaining information from him was more valuable than him spending more years in prison, which is logically correct. And here we have reached the end of our story. Don't forget to like if you like,